She had everything money could buy. A penthouse in Manhattan that overlooked Central Park from the 47th floor, where the city spread out beneath her like a living map of ambition and consequence. A wardrobe that cost more than most people's mortgages, curated twice a year by a stylist named Renata, who flew in from Paris and spent 3 days reorganizing what Victoria Hartwell would wear so that every public appearance communicated exactly the right combination of power and approachability. A father whose name was etched in gold on the side of a skyscraper on Park Avenue, and whose photograph appeared in the Forbes list with a reliability that had, over the years, stopped feeling extraordinary and started feeling simply like the backdrop of her life. And yet, on a Tuesday morning in September, 28-year-old Victoria Hartwell stood in the back corridor of a bustling midtown restaurant, tying a plain black apron around her waist with slightly trembling fingers, her hair pulled into a simple low ponytail, her face entirely bare of the designer makeup she had been wearing since she was 16 years old. No bodyguards waiting outside. No personal assistant whispering in her earpiece about the afternoon schedule. No tabloid photographers crouched behind parked cars, hoping to catch her arriving somewhere important. Just Victoria, a small notepad tucked in her apron pocket, a pen behind her ear, and the terrifying and exhilarating reality that nobody in this building, not a single person on the other side of that kitchen door, had the slightest idea who she really was. She was not just any waitress applying for any job. She was the only daughter and presumed heir of Gerald Hartwell, the founder and chief executive officer of Hartwell International, a hospitality empire that had, over the course of 30 years, grown from a single diner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into a portfolio of 43 restaurants, hotels, and resort properties spread across the United States, with a combined valuation that industry analysts placed it somewhere between $12 and $14 billion. The very restaurant she had just walked into, the Meridian, tucked between a luxury watch boutique and a private members club on a quiet block in Midtown Manhattan, was one of those 43 properties. She had grown up eating in this dining room. She had attended the opening night gala when she was 13 years old in a dress her father had bought her at Bergdorf's, and she had sat at the head table and felt, for the first time in her young life, what it meant to be part of something her father had built with his own hands and his own will. She had been educated at the finest boarding schools in New England, and then at the London School of Economics, and then at Cornell. She had shaken hands with 3 sitting American presidents, shared meals with members of European royalty, and been photographed at enough charity galas and industry conferences and ribbon-cutting ceremonies that her face was, in certain circles, genuinely recognizable. But right now, in this moment, as a customer at table 7 snapped his fingers impatiently in the direction of the service station, and the lunch rush began to build its familiar roar, Victoria Hartwell was just a girl in a borrowed apron trying to survive her very first shift. And what was about to happen inside these walls in the weeks and months that followed this unremarkable Tuesday morning would change everything she believed she understood about love, about deception, about the price of protecting yourself, and about the extraordinary and dangerous courage it takes to let another human being find you before the world has already told them who you are. Before we go any further, before we follow Victoria through that kitchen door and watch her pick up her first table and attempt to remember the specials and try not to betray herself in 100 small ways she has not yet anticipated, we want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to disappear? Not in a frightening or permanent way. Not to leave everything behind or walk away from your responsibilities or pretend that your history does not exist, but to simply, for a chosen period of time, step entirely out of the version of yourself that the world has collectively decided you are and walk, unnoticed, unnamed, unburdened, into an entirely different life where nobody knows what you are worth or who your father is or what your apartment looks like or what the gossip column said about you last spring. Where you are, for perhaps the first time, simply a person with a ponytail and a notepad and a job to do. That is exactly what Victoria Hartwell chose to do. And while her reasons were complicated in the specific way that the reasons of intelligent, wounded, deeply self-aware people always are, while the plan she had constructed with careful and methodical precision seemed perfectly logical from inside her own mind, The world she was voluntarily stepping into had absolutely no interest in playing along with her carefully written script. Because the world, as Victoria was about to discover, has a way of improvising. So here are the questions we want you to hold on to for the next hour, because every single one of them is going to matter before we reach the end of this story. Why would a 28-year-old woman with 14 billion reasons to stay exactly where she was choose to disguise herself and take a job as a waitress in her own father's restaurant, under a false name, without telling a single member of her family what she was doing? What was she looking for, really? Was it love, the way it appeared on the surface? Or was it something deeper and more fundamental than love? Something closer to proof? Proof that she was lovable not for what she represented, but for who she actually was. And then, when the mask was eventually pulled away, when the carefully constructed fiction she had been living began to unravel in the most public and humiliating way possible, would the man she had spent months falling for be able to look past what she had done and choose her anyway? Or would the discovery of her deception confirm every fear she had spent her adult life accumulating? That the version of herself she most wanted someone to see was the one version that her real life made it nearly impossible to show? Stay with us, because this story is more complicated than it looks from the outside, more heartbreaking, more human, and considerably more surprising than any headline about it ever managed to convey. To understand why Victoria Hartwell made the choice she made, you have to start not with Victoria, but with her father. Because Gerald Hartwell is, in many ways, the first chapter of this story, even though he spent most of it sitting in an office 42 floors above street level, largely unaware of what his daughter was doing in the restaurant he had opened 25 years earlier when nobody believed he could make it work. Gerald Hartwell was born in 1958 in a two-bedroom apartment in the Larimer neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the second of three children raised by his father, Robert, a steelworker at the Homestead Works, and his mother, Eleanor, a librarian at the Carnegie Library branch on Penn Avenue. The Hartwell family was not poor in the way that poverty is sometimes romanticized. They were not colorfully struggling or dramatically resilient. They were simply working people, living within their means with the quiet, patient discipline that characterizes a particular generation of American families who grew up understanding that money was not something you had. It was something you were always carefully trying not to run out of. Gerald was not, by his own account, a remarkable child. He was reasonably good at mathematics and not particularly good at sitting still. He liked cooking, which he learned from his grandmother, a small, fierce woman named Ida who had grown up in rural West Virginia and believed that feeding people well was both a practical skill and a moral obligation. He liked the way a good meal transformed the atmosphere of a room. He liked the way people became slightly more themselves when they were comfortable and fed. He worked at a diner on Penn Avenue through high school, first as a dishwasher and then as a short-order cook, and somewhere in those years of standing over a flat-top grill at 6 in the morning watching the neighborhood wake up and come in for breakfast, the idea that would eventually become Hartwell International began to take its first quiet shape. Gerald did not go to college. He took night classes in business administration at a community college in Pittsburgh for 2 years, worked during the day, saved every dollar he could, and at the age of 22 borrowed $3,000 from his mother and used it, along with every cent of his savings, to put a deposit on a small diner in the Strip District that had been closed for 8 months and smelled, as he described it in an interview many years later, like old grease and missed opportunity. He named it Eleanor's, after his mother, who cried when she found out and then told him he had better not let it fail or she would want her money back. Eleanor's became, within 2 years, the most consistently busy breakfast spot in the Strip District. Within 5 years, Gerald had opened 2 more locations. Within 10, he had relocated to New York, partnered with a real estate developer he had met through a catering contract, and opened the Meridian. Within 20, Hartwell International was a publicly traded company with properties in 18 states and a workforce of over 4,000 people. The story of how Gerald built his empire has been told many times in business profiles and in a book he allowed a journalist to write about him in 2008, and in the remarks he gives at industry conferences where he is invariably the most quietly compelling person in the room. What is told less often is the cost. Eleanor's had a long marriage to a woman named Catherine Voss, a designer from Chicago whom Gerald met in 1992 at a restaurant industry conference in Las Vegas. Catherine was intelligent and warm and deeply creative, and she was also, by her own careful assessment, not someone who had fully understood what she was marrying into when she married Gerald Hartwell. She had understood the ambition in the abstract. She had understood that he worked long hours and thought about the business constantly and had difficulty, sometimes, distinguishing between the things that required his immediate attention and the things that did not. What she had not understood, not until several years of marriage had clarified it with a kind of slow, unavoidable precision, was that for Gerald, the work was not a means to an end. It was not something he did in order to eventually relax and be present and live. The work was the thing itself, the building of it, the solving of it, the constant forward motion of it. She stayed for 12 years and left quietly when Victoria was 9, moving back to Chicago, where she remarried a man named Dennis who was a high school history teacher and who was, by all accounts, a perfectly content and not particularly ambitious person. Victoria spent summers with her mother in Chicago until she was 14 and then, with a teenager's determination to be dramatic about things, declared that she preferred New York and stopped going. She and Catherine have maintained, throughout Victoria's adult life, a relationship that could be described as cordial and occasional and tinged, on both sides, with the specific sadness of people who know they could be closer and have simply never quite managed to close the distance. Victoria Eleanor Hartwell was born in 1995, the only child of Gerald and Catherine, named for her father's ambition and her grandmother's library. From the outside, her childhood looked like every dream that working-class families pasted on a vision boards. The Manhattan apartment, the private school in the East 70s where tuition cost more per year than most people's salaries. The summers in the Hamptons before Catherine left, and after that the summers at boarding school programs in New England, language immersion in France at 15, a gap year coordinated by a company that specialized in gap years for the children of people who could afford to treat them as opportunities rather than uncertainties. From the inside, Victoria's childhood was something considerably more complicated, in the way that childhoods spent in the proximity of enormous ambition and enormous absence tend to be. Gerald loved his daughter. This is not in question. He loved her in the absolute, unconditional way of a man for whom fatherhood was one of the few things in his life that he had not constructed through effort and strategy, but had simply received. He showed up for the things that mattered. The school plays, the graduation ceremonies, the moment when she called him at midnight from her dorm room at the London School of Economics, barely 18 years old, homesick in a way she had not expected and could not quite name. He answered the phone immediately, which was not something he did for most people, and he talked to her for 2 hours about nothing in particular, about Pittsburgh and Eleanor's and his grandmother Ida's, cooking, and 100 small, ordinary things from before the empire existed. And Victoria told Sophie years later that it was the most like his real self she had ever heard him sound. But the space between the things that mattered was very long and very quiet. And children who grow up in quiet spaces learn things about themselves that children who grow up surrounded by noise do not learn. Victoria learned, young and thoroughly, how to read a room, how to assess what a person needed from her before they had fully formed the need themselves, how to be charming and self-contained and easy to be around. She learned how to be good company, which is different from being known. She learned how to perform the version of herself that each situation required, which is a useful skill and an exhausting one, and, over time, a profoundly isolating one. She was brilliant academically. She graduated from the London School of Economics with a first-class degree in economics and management. She completed a master's degree in hospitality management at Cornell, where she was, by the assessment of her professors, one of the most practically minded students they had encountered in years, someone who grasped the theoretical frameworks quickly and then immediately, instinctively, began asking how they applied to the specific, messy, human reality of running a restaurant or a hotel. She had interned at Hartwell International every summer since she was 16. She had worked in the reservations department and the events planning team and the corporate strategy group. She had sat in on board meetings and management reviews and due diligence calls for potential acquisitions. She knew the business the way some people know a language, not just the vocabulary, but the grammar, the idioms, the particular music of it. What she did not know was how to trust another human being with the version of herself that existed beneath all of it. She had tried. This is the part of Victoria's story that never made it into the business profiles or the society columns, and it is the part that matters most. She had tried 3 times, seriously and with genuine hope, and 3 times the experience had confirmed a fear that she had been carrying since childhood in one form or another, which was this: that the name Hartwell was louder than anything she could say about herself, that it preceded her into every room, that it answered questions about her before she had opened her mouth, and that the people who were drawn to her were, more often than not, drawn first to what she represented: wealth, access, connection, the proximity to power, and only afterward, sometimes, to the actual person behind it. The first relationship she had thought was real was with a man named Christopher, whom she met during her final year at Cornell. He was in the law school, sharp and funny, and seemingly unimpressed by her last name in a way she found genuinely refreshing. They dated for 14 months. She found out he had been leaking information about the Hartwell family. Small things, social calendar items, guest lists, overheard remarks at dinner she had brought him to a journalist at a tabloid publication. He had been doing it from the beginning. When she confronted him, he did not deny it. He said he had needed the money and it had seemed harmless. She drove home from that conversation and did not cry, because she was 23 years old and had already learned not to cry where it could be observed, and she poured herself a glass of wine and sat at her kitchen counter and felt something settle in her chest like a stone settling to the bottom of a lake. The second was a man named Richard, a venture capitalist she met at a charity gala in Chicago when she was 25. Richard was polished and attentive, and she believed for 18 months, genuinely in love with her. He proposed on a rooftop in Tribeca on a warm evening in August, and she said yes and felt, for approximately 3 weeks, something that resembled uncomplicated happiness. Then her father's legal team, conducting the routine background check that Gerald applied to all of Victoria's significant partners, discovered that Richard had been quietly lobbying Gerald's office for a private equity partnership worth $200 million through a third-party introduction firm, a lobbying effort that had begun 4 months before Richard and Victoria had apparently met by chance at a charity event. The conversation Victoria had with Richard after that discovery lasted 22 minutes. She has never discussed its contents publicly. She returned the ring by courier. The third relationship was quieter and in some ways more painful, because it ended not in betrayal, but in honest impossibility. Daniel was kind and warm and not especially ambitious, and genuinely, she believed, fond of her. He was a high school art teacher in Brooklyn, which she had found deeply, specifically appealing after 2 years of men whose identities were built from their professional credentials. He was patient and funny and did not appear to want anything from her except her time. But he was also a man who flinched every single time they walked into a restaurant together, and the host's face changed when she gave her name, at the gap it represented between his world and hers, who grew progressively more uncomfortable at charity events and industry dinners, not because he disliked the people, but because he could not find, no matter how hard he searched, a version of himself that fit comfortably in the spaces that her life required her to occupy. One evening, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village that he had chosen specifically because it was unpretentious, he looked at her with eyes full of something that was not unkindness, but was also undeniably a particular kind of sorrow, and said, very gently and very honestly, that he did not think he was someone who could ever feel like her equal. That no matter how much they cared for each other, the structural difference in their lives was not something he knew how to live inside of with dignity. Victoria told him she understood. She meant it, which was the worst part. She drove home in a taxi and sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the city for the entire 40-minute ride without taking out her phone. And when she got upstairs, she sat on the floor of her kitchen, because sometimes you just need to sit on a floor, and she thought about what it meant that she could understand completely and without resentment every single person who had left her. and whether understanding something meant you had learned to accept it or simply that you had become very good at pretending you had. By the time she turned 28, Victoria Hartwell had arrived at a conclusion that she could not argue herself out of, no matter how many times she tried. The problem was not the men. The problem was the introduction. Every person she had ever met had met Victoria Hartwell before they had met Victoria. They had met the name, the inheritance, the skyscraper with the gold lettering, the Forbes list entry, the society column appearances, the gravitational field of wealth and visibility that surrounded her everywhere she went. And that introduction, however much any of them tried to set it aside, shaped everything that followed. The only solution Victoria could identify, the only one that felt like it might actually work, was to remove the introduction entirely. To meet someone before they knew who she was. To let the connection form in the absence of everything that usually contaminated it. And to give herself, for the first time in her adult life, the experience of being simply a person. Not Victoria Hartwell. Not Gerald Hartwell's daughter. Not the heir to $14 billion. Just a woman with a ponytail and a job and opinions about the daily specials. There's a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who grow up in the kind of wealth that is visible. Not just comfortable wealth, the quiet, well-maintained kind that provides good schools and reliable vacations and a house with a backyard in a nice neighborhood. The kind of wealth that has a public dimension. That makes a person's name something other people have opinions about before they have met the person it belongs to. That places a child, before they are old enough to understand what is happening, into a particular social category that follows them through every room they walk into for the rest of their lives. Victoria grew up in this kind of wealth, and she understood its mechanics before she understood very much else about the world. She understood, at 7 years old, that certain other children at her school behaved differently around her than they did around each other. That there was a quality to their attention that had a slightly self-conscious edge to it, a slight calibration, as though they were always aware, on some level, that she was not entirely the same kind of person they were. She could not have named this at 7. She could name it at 17, with the precision of someone who has had a decade to observe and catalog and slowly arrive at language for something she had first felt in the body rather than the mind. She could name it at 28 with the weary, honest clarity of someone who has lived with a thing long enough to see it clearly without needing to defend herself against what it says. The clarity did not make it easier. This is one of the things about self-knowledge that nobody tells you when they recommend it as a goal. The understanding of a problem and the relief of a problem are not the same thing. You can understand completely why the water in the pipes is cold and still be cold. Victoria understood completely the social geometry of her own position, and it still made her lonely in a way she could not entirely explain to people who had not experienced something similar, because the loneliness looked from the outside like nothing at all. It looked like a penthouse and a wardrobe and a social calendar full of people who were happy to be in her company. The closest she came to explaining it, and the explanation that James had responded to most directly on their first dinner in the East Village, was this: she was always meeting herself before she met anyone. They encountered Victoria Hartwell, with everything that name and that context implied, before they had ever had the experience of simply encountering Victoria. And the version of her they met first, the public version, the biographical version, the version assembled from news articles and social media, and the observations of mutual friends who had their own complicated feelings about wealth and access, was a version she had not assembled and could not fully control and could not speak to on its own terms, because it was not entirely real. It was a projection, a composite, an artifact of visibility. She was the person behind it, trying to make herself known through it, and there was no clear way to do that. No matter what she said or did, the name arrived first, and the rest of her arrived second. And by the time the rest of her arrived, the shape of the room had already been altered by what came before. This was the problem she had been trying to solve for 10 years. This was the problem she thought she had, finally, in the March afternoon in her father's office, found a workable approach to. Whether it was the right approach is a question that reasonable people continue to disagree about. But it is not possible to understand what she did or why, without understanding this, that the loneliness of being perpetually preceded was not a small thing, and the desire to be free of it, even briefly, even imperfectly, was not a vanity or a whim. It was the most human thing about her, the thing that made her, beneath all the biographical information, exactly the same as everyone else. Everyone who has ever wanted to be known for who they are rather than for what they represent, which is to say everyone who has ever been known for anything, has understood the specific wish that drove Victoria Hartwell through the staff entrance of the Meridian on a Tuesday morning with a plain black apron and a borrowed name. They may not have had the means, she had to act on it, but they have felt the thing underneath it. They have felt it completely. The idea came to her on a Thursday afternoon in late March, 3 weeks after her 28th birthday, sitting in her father's office on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell building in Midtown Manhattan. She was reviewing quarterly performance reports for a cluster of Northeast properties, the Meridian among them, when she came across the staffing file. The Meridian had a vacancy. 2 vacancies, actually. A senior server who had given notice to move to Los Angeles, and a junior server who had simply, in the way of junior servers everywhere, stopped showing up. Frank DeLuca, the general manager, had flagged it in his weekly report. He needed staff by the end of the month. The position paid $19 an hour plus tips, which at the Meridian's price point and volume typically meant total compensation somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 annually. The shift structure was 5 days a week, split between lunch and dinner service. Victoria read the file twice, and then she stared out her father's 42nd floor windows of the city for a long time, and the idea arrived fully formed in a way that the most genuinely dangerous ideas tend to, not as a gradual accumulation of reasoning, but as a sudden clarity, a door opening onto a room you did not know was there. She was going to apply for that job, not as Victoria Hartwell, not as anyone connected to the Hartwell name or the Hartwell empire, as a regular applicant with a regular resume under a different name. She was going to work the floor of the Meridian as an ordinary server, in plain sight, in the middle of her father's most beloved restaurant, and nobody was going to know. The practical objections presented themselves immediately. Frank had worked for the company for 16 years and had met Victoria on at least a dozen occasions, at company events and property visits, and a Christmas dinner at the Hartwell apartment 3 years ago. There were staff photographs on the internal company website. The Meridian team received the company newsletter. Any thorough Googling of her face could, theoretically, expose her. But Victoria was also someone who had spent her entire adult life being underestimated, and she knew something about the reliability of human inattention. People see what they expect to see. A person walking through the staff entrance in jeans and a ponytail, with darker hair and a pair of ordinary glasses and a name that is not remarkable, is not the same visual category as the heiress they have seen photographed in a ball gown at a charity gala. The brain does not make that connection unless it is specifically prompted to look. She went home that evening and opened her laptop. She created a new email address. She drafted a resume under the name Victoria Harris, keeping her first name because changing it entirely felt unnecessarily complicated, and she knew she would not reliably respond to something completely different. The last name Harris was her maternal grandmother's maiden name, which felt somehow appropriate. She built out the resume carefully. 2 years at a fictional restaurant in Boston called the Harbor Room, which she researched thoroughly enough to speak plausibly about its menu and layout and staffing structure. 18 months at a hotel restaurant in Chicago called the Lakeview, which she also researched to the point of being able to describe the uniform and the floor plan and the name of the executive chef. She listed a personal reference as a woman named Carol, which was Sophie's middle name. Sophie being Victoria's best friend since their first year at the London School of Economics, the only person in Victoria's life who knew about the plan and who had responded to it with a combination of alarm, admiration, and the kind of resigned affection one extends to a person who is going to do what they are going to do regardless of your objections. Sophie had said, "You know this is going to be a disaster." Victoria had said, "It is going to be fine." Sophie had said, "I will have the wine ready." 3 days after submitting the online application, Victoria received an email from the Meridian's assistant manager inviting her to come in for an interview. She wore dark jeans, a plain white shirt, and flat shoes she bought specifically for the occasion. She colored her hair 2 shades darker using a box dye from a drugstore on Lexington Avenue, an experience she found unexpectedly enjoyable. She bought a pair of clear lens glasses from a fashion accessory store in Soho. She arrived 10 minutes early, sat in the small waiting area outside the manager's office, and took 3 slow breaths the way Sophie had taught her during a meditation app phased 2 winters ago. Frank DeLuca did not conduct the interview. Frank was traveling that week. Victoria had known this because she had access to the management travel calendar, and so the interview was conducted instead by his assistant manager, a cheerful and efficient 30-year-old woman named Priya who asked Victoria a set of standard service industry questions and seemed satisfied with the answers. Victoria had spent 4 hours the previous evening reviewing common interview questions for server positions and preparing answers that were honest where they could be and plausible where they needed to be. She talked about her love for the energy of a full-service dining room. She talked about the satisfaction of reading a table correctly, knowing when guests wanted to be left alone and when they wanted engagement, knowing when to speed the pace and when to slow it down. All of this was true. All of it came from years of watching the dining rooms in her father's restaurants, from dozens of meals in which she had unconsciously analyzed the service as much as the food. Priya offered her the job on the spot, subject to a background check. Victoria had anticipated the background check and had prepared for it. She had an address, a social security number corresponding to the name Victoria Harris on a legal document trail she had arranged through a privacy attorney she trusted completely, a paper trail that would pass a standard employer verification and go no further. She was offered $12 an hour plus tips during a training period of 3 weeks, rising to the full rate thereafter. She accepted. She walked out of the Meridian through the side entrance on the cross street, stood in the September sunlight for a moment with the sounds of the city around her, and thought, "This is either the best idea I have ever had or the worst, and I will not know which until it is over." She texted Sophie, "I got the job." Sophie texted back, "God help us all." Her first day was a Monday. She arrived at 8:45 in the morning for a 9 o'clock start, dressed in the black pants and white shirt that comprised the server uniform, which she had purchased the previous week. She had been assigned to shadow a senior server named Diane Marchetti for her first 3 days. Diane was 51 years old, had been working at the Meridian for 11 years, and was, by general consensus among the staff, the best server in the building. She was sharp and warm and possessed of a dry, affectionate humor that expressed itself in brief, perfectly timed observations delivered at the exact moment they would be most effective. She looked Victoria up and down on the morning of the first day with the assessing eye of someone who has trained a great many people and learned to identify very quickly which ones are going to be trouble. She said, "You look nervous." Victoria said, "I'm a little nervous." Diane said, "Good. Nervous means you understand what you're doing here. It is the ones who are not nervous that worry me. They're usually the ones who think service is simple, and it is not simple. Now, let me show you where we keep the order pads." The first week was humbling in a way that Victoria had not fully anticipated, despite having spent considerable time imagining it. She knew the theory of restaurant service. She had analyzed the data of it. She had sat in management meetings where the guest experience metric were discussed and had offered, on multiple occasions, thoughtful and well-received suggestions about how to improve them. What she had not done was stand at a table of 4 during a busy Friday lunch service with 2 different guests, asking her questions simultaneously while a third flagged her down from across the room, and the kitchen called her name from the past with a plate that was going to get cold. And in that context, the theory of restaurant service became something very different. It became physical. It became about the body, about where you stood and how you moved, and the precise choreography of multiple simultaneous demands. Diane watched her, the first week, with patient attention, offering corrections in a quiet voice that did not draw attention. She showed Victoria how to carry 3 plates without looking like you were about to drop them. She showed her the particular quality of presence that meant guests felt attended to without feeling watched. She showed her how to read the room from the service station, how to know without being close enough to hear the conversation, whether a table was celebrating or grieving or conducting a business meeting that should not be interrupted. Victoria paid attention. This was one of the things she was genuinely good at, paying attention. Within 2 weeks, she was off her training period and on the floor on her own. Within 4 weeks, Diane was letting her run the more demanding sections during peak service. Victoria was quietly and somewhat to her own surprise, becoming good at this. The practicalities of what Victoria was attempting were more complicated than they appeared from the outside, and it is worth spending some time with them, because the care with which she built her alternative identity tells you a great deal about who she is and how she thinks. Victoria was, at her core, a person who solved problems methodically. It was the quality her professors at Cornell had found most impressive, and it was the quality that made her genuinely good at the strategic and operational sides of the hospitality business. She did not act on instinct alone. She acted on instinct informed by thorough preparation, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more reliable. The construction of the Victoria Harris identity took her approximately 3 weeks, working in the evenings after her regular working day, in the home office of her penthouse apartment with the door closed. She did not use any of her regular devices for this work. She purchased a new laptop and a new phone, both paid for with cash from electronic stores in neighborhoods she did not regularly frequent. She established a new email address, a new set of social media accounts that were largely dormant but existed in enough detail to be plausible if anyone looked, and a personal cell phone number registered to the name Victoria Harris at an address in Brooklyn that was a postal service box she had rented for the purpose. She had worked, previously, on a company project involving the verification systems used for standard employment background checks, and she understood their limitations. A standard employer background check verifies identity against existing records and checks for criminal history. It does not involve the kind of deep investigative work that would uncover a deliberately constructed parallel identity, provided that identity was built with sufficient care. The personal reference she listed on her resume, Carol Marcus, a former supervisor at the fictional Boston restaurant, was Sophie, who had agreed to play this role under sufferance and who had spent several evenings in September preparing herself to answer employer verification calls in a voice that was slightly different from her own. The call from Meridian's HR department came on a Thursday morning. Sophie took it in her home office, described Victoria Harris as an excellent server with strong guest interaction skills and a genuine feel for the dining room, and answered 4 questions about fictional shifts at a fictional restaurant with the confidence of a woman who has spent considerable time preparing answers to hypothetical questions and is, by profession, a corporate attorney accustomed to the careful construction of narratives under pressure. The call lasted 6 minutes. It was the most nerve-wracking 6 minutes of Sophie's professional life, which was saying something given that she had argued before a federal appeals court twice. The physical elements of the disguise were the part that Victoria was most uncertain about, and that turned out to be the least of her concerns. The hair color was the most significant change. She went from her natural medium brown, which was well documented in photographs, to a darker shade that changed the overall impression of her face more significantly than she had expected. The glasses were clear-lensed and therefore entirely functional. She wore them throughout her time at the Meridian without issue. The clothing was simply different from her usual register, plainer, more practical, chosen for comfort and durability rather than for the subtle signals that expensive clothing sends in rooms full of people who know how to read them. She did not wear jewelry beyond a small pair of plain stud earrings. She wore flatter shoes than she usually wore. She carried a plain canvas bag rather than the structured leather bags she used in her regular life. None of these changes were individually remarkable. Together, they produced a person who was visually consistent with the narrative she was offering, a 30-something server from Boston who had moved to New York looking for a fresh start. The more important disguise, and the one she had thought about more carefully than any of the physical elements, was behavioral. Victoria knew that the physical changes would get her through the door and past the initial recognition threshold. What would keep her safe over months of sustained contact with people who were observant and sharp and professionally attuned to human behavior was something else entirely. She had to change not just how she looked, but how she moved through space. Victoria Hartwell, in her regular life, moved with the unconscious authority of someone who has never had reason to doubt her right to occupy any room she walked into. She did not do this deliberately. It was simply the physical grammar of her upbringing, the way years of private schools and high-end restaurants and professional environments where her opinion was solicited and respected had settled into her body language. Victoria Harris could not move that way. Victoria Harris was a server in a new city looking for a foothold. She had to carry herself differently, slightly less settled, slightly more alert to the cues of the environment, slightly less proprietary about the space she occupied. She practiced this. It sounds strange, but it is true. She practiced walking differently, sitting differently, entering rooms differently. Not performing timidity. That would have been obvious and unsustainable and wrong besides. But calibrating the physical confidence she naturally carried to something appropriate for the position she was occupying. She found, to her surprise, that the practice was not as difficult as she had expected. Because the truth was that Victoria Harris was not entirely a fiction. She was a real possibility. The version of Victoria that would have existed if the inheritance had not. The version that would have been making her way on her own intelligence and her own competence and her own energy without the scaffolding of the family name. Victoria had always believed, privately and with some difficulty, that she would have been good regardless, that she was genuinely capable, not just positioned. The months at the Meridian were, in one sense, a test of that belief. And the result of the test was this. She was right. She was genuinely good. Not the best. Diane was the best, and Marcus in his own way, and Tommy in his particular zone of expertise. But she was genuinely competent, and she became genuinely skilled. And the satisfaction she found in that competence was not the satisfaction of the heiress playing at ordinary life. It was the satisfaction of discovering that the ordinary life, in its physical and human specificity, was something she could inhabit with real capability. That she could earn her place in a room through the quality of her work, not just through the accident of her birth. That was something the Forbes profile had never given her, and the board meetings had never given her, and the 47 floors of the Hartwell building had never given her. That was something she had found by tying on a plain black apron and carrying plates through a lunch rush until her feet hurt, and it was one of the most important things she had ever learned about herself. The Meridian at lunchtime was its own complete world. This is something Victoria had known intellectually and now understood in her body in a way that was entirely different. It was a world with its own geography. The warm arc of the bar section where the regulars sat, the slightly more formal center floor where business lunches unfolded their particular theater, the quieter tables along the west wall where people came to have conversations they needed privacy for, the window tables where you sat when you wanted to be seen. It had its own social hierarchy, Diane at the top, by virtue of experience and competence and the particular authority that comes from being the person everyone turns to when something goes wrong. Then the senior servers, Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old from the Bronx who had been working at the Meridian for 4 years while pursuing a degree in culinary arts at night school, and who had the gift of making every guest feel, within 30 seconds of meeting him, as though they were his favorite person in the room, Angela Park, a 33-year-old Korean-American woman who ran her section with the precise efficiency of someone who has decided that excellence is not a mood but a methodology, and Tommy Reyes, a 40-year-old lifer who had worked in Manhattan restaurants since he was 19 and had the philosophical equanimity of someone who has seen everything the dining room can produce and has made his peace with all of it. The kitchen was a different world again. Rosa Vasquez's domain, executive chef and absolute sovereign, a 44-year-old woman from San Antonio who had trained in France and worked in 3 Michelin-starred restaurants before Gerald Hartwell, had recruited her to the Meridian 15 years ago with an offer that apparently included both a very good salary and the promise that nobody would tell her how to run her kitchen. Rosa ran a kitchen that was intense and exacting, and also, by the account of everyone who had ever worked in it, one of the most professionally formative environments in the city. She did not tolerate sloppiness or excuses or the kind of ego that prioritized individual expression over the collective standard. She also threw the most elaborate birthday celebrations for her kitchen staff of anyone in the industry, baked her own bread every morning, and kept a small photograph of her grandmother taped to the corner of her workstation. Victoria was fascinated by all of it. Not in the detached, analytical way she had been fascinated by the business data of it, but in the way you are fascinated by something you are inside of, something that is making demands of your attention and energy and presence in a way that data on a spreadsheet never quite does. She found herself thinking about the restaurant when she was not there, about the rhythm of the morning setup and the building energy of the lunch rush and the particular quality of the dining room during that late afternoon lull between lunch service ending and dinner prep beginning, when the light came through the windows at a low angle and the tables were being reset and the room was temporarily quiet and it felt, briefly, like a theater between performances, all its potential suspended. Marcus became her closest friend on the floor, which surprised her because Marcus was the person who had been most skeptical of her on the first day. He had looked at her with a frank, appraising expression and said, "You don't seem like someone who needs this job." She had said, "Honestly, I need it more than you know." He had studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable and then nodded, which was apparently sufficient, because from that day forward he treated her with the easy, teasing warmth he extended to everyone he considered a legitimate colleague. His jokes were, by any objective standard, extremely bad. They were the kind of jokes that made you groan and then laugh against your will, the kind that were so committed to their own badness that they became charming by sheer force of earnestness. Victoria laughed at every one of them, which Marcus said made her either his best audience or a person of questionable judgment, possibly both. Diane was watching her more carefully than Victoria initially realized. Diane was someone who noticed things. It was the quality that made her exceptional at service, and also, in retrospect, the quality that would ultimately create the most significant problem of Victoria's undercover life. But that revelation was still months away, and in those early weeks, Diane's watchfulness expressed itself only as attentiveness, as the quiet, experienced eye of a mentor tracking a mentee's development, noting the gaps and the competencies, adjusting her coaching accordingly. What Diane noticed in those first weeks was that Victoria was smarter than most new hires she had trained. Not faster. She was actually slightly slower than average initially, because she was thinking about the theory of each thing rather than letting her body learn the muscle memory of it. But she absorbed information at a remarkable rate. She asked exactly the right questions. She made a mistake once and never made the same mistake again. She had, Diane told Tommy one evening after their shift, an understanding of the guest that went beyond what you could teach someone. As though she had spent a very long time studying what people needed in a restaurant before she had ever worked in one, which was, in a very specific sense, exactly true. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is only just beginning to get interesting, and you do not want to miss what happens next. The Meridian had been part of the Manhattan dining landscape for 25 years by the time Victoria walked through its staff entrance, and it had the particular quality of institutions that have earned their place over time, not the breathless newness of a restaurant everyone is talking about right now, but the settled confidence of somewhere that has decided what it is and does not need to keep explaining itself. The dining room seated 94 people, which was not large by Manhattan standards, but felt generous given the care with which each table had been placed. The chef's counter ran along the kitchen wall and seated 8, and Rose's team considered the counter their most important space, the one where guests were closest to the work and where the standards of performance were therefore the highest. Gerald had opened the Meridian in 1998 with a specific intention: to create the restaurant he had wanted to eat at when he first arrived in New York from Pittsburgh, exhausted and underfunded and determined, a young man who could not yet afford the restaurants that impressed him and who had spent considerable time sitting at the bar of establishments he could afford, studying what the ones that truly worked had understood about the relationship between space and hospitality. What he had concluded was that the best restaurants made people feel, simultaneously, that they had entered somewhere a little more beautiful and considered than the outside world, and that the beautiful and considered space was for them, that they belonged in it, that it was not performing itself at them, but genuinely serving them. This was the philosophy he had given Rosa when he hired her, and Rosa had extended it into the kitchen in ways he had not fully anticipated. Rosa's food was technically excellent and also, at its core, built around a particular idea, that a meal was best when it felt, at some level, like something that had been made for the specific person eating it. Not literally. She was cooking for a full dining room, not for individuals. But the precision of the seasoning, the care with which each dish was constructed and sent out, communicated an attention to the guest's experience that was, when it worked, as close to personal as mass hospitality could get. Victoria understood this from the management side. She had read the guest satisfaction reports and the chef reviews and the industry commentary about the Meridian's particular quality. What she had not understood, until she was working the floor, was how that philosophy expressed itself in the specific moment-to-moment interactions of service. She had not understood that it expressed itself in the 12 seconds between a guest sitting down and a server appearing with water. Not so fast as to feel rushed, not so slow as to feel ignored. That it expressed itself in the way the bread came out, Rosa's bread, warm and with good butter, not as an afterthought, but as a statement of welcome, the first thing the kitchen offered and the thing that set the register for everything that followed. It expressed itself in the way Angela Park managed a table that was clearly on a tight business lunch schedule, reading the pace they needed from the way they held their menus and the angle of their bodies and the frequency with which they checked their phones, and adjusting her service to give them the efficiency they needed without it feeling transactional. It expressed itself in the way Marcus could tell by the end of a first course whether a couple was celebrating or were in the early stages of a difficult conversation, and adjust his presence accordingly, warmer and more engaged for the celebration, more invisible and precise for the difficulty. These were skills that could not be quantified in a satisfaction survey. They could not be captured in a training manual, or not fully, not the way the actual practice of them could be learned by doing them day after day until they became instinctive. Victoria was watching all of this and absorbing it and filing it, and, without initially intending to, beginning to understand something that would eventually reshape the company her father had built. The Meridian worked because of the people who worked in it, not because of the corporate strategy that had selected the location or the capital investment that had fitted it out, or the marketing budget that supported the brand, or the vendor relationships that supplied the kitchen. All of those things mattered, and none of them were the thing. The thing was Diane, who could assess a table from the service station with the accuracy of someone who has developed a genuine fluency in human behavior. The thing was Rosa, who cared about her bread in the specific way that people care about things when they understand that the care itself is the product. The thing was Marcus, whose terrible jokes had a hospitality function beyond their face value. They were a form of warmth, a statement that this room was a place where a small, genuine, unhurried human exchange was possible. Victoria had been analyzing Hartwell International's performance data for 6 years. She had spent 6 months inside one of its properties, not analyzing but participating. And what she understood at the end of those 6 months that she had not understood at the beginning was this: the data told you where you were. It did not tell you how to get somewhere better. Getting somewhere better required understanding what was actually happening in the gap between the data points. What was happening in the 12 seconds before the water appeared? What was happening in the moment Rosa decided how to plate a dish? What was happening in the way Diane's eyes moved across a dining room and registered, before any of it was conscious, everything that needed attention and everything that did not? That was not in any quarterly report, and it could not be put in one. It could only be transmitted through contact, through standing in a room, doing the work, making the mistakes, developing the muscle memory, and paying attention with the specific quality of attention that comes from being genuinely responsible for an outcome rather than observing from a safe and comfortable distance. James Calloway came into the Meridian for the first time on a Wednesday in the first week of May, 3 weeks after Victoria had completed her training period and begun working the floor on her own. He was 32 years old, Originally from Savannah, Georgia, raised by a single mother who taught elementary school and a grandmother who had kept the family fed and spiritually anchored with equal parts love and Baptist faith. He had come to New York for college, engineering at City College on a partial scholarship, and had stayed the way people who fall in love with the specific energy of New York tend to stay, pulled by something they cannot quite articulate beyond the fact that the city suits the version of themselves they are trying to become. He worked for a structural engineering firm called McKinley & Brock in Lower Manhattan, a mid-size operation that specialized in the structural assessment and renovation of older buildings. He liked his work in the way that people like work when it connects to something true about their character. He was a person who found genuine satisfaction in making things solid, in finding the places where structures had become compromised over time and figuring out how to make them strong again. He arrived at the Meridian that first Wednesday, carrying a copy of a novel he had been reading on the subway, a worn paperback with a cracked spine that suggested it had been read more than once. He sat in the booth near the window that would become, over the following months, his regular table. He looked at the menu with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who takes food seriously without being performative about it. When Victoria came to take his order, he looked up from the menu and said, "Hi, just hi," the way people say it when they actually mean it rather than as a prelude to telling you what they want. She said hi back. He ordered the grilled salmon with the lemon caper sauce. He asked if the bread was made in-house. She said yes. Rosa made it fresh every morning. He nodded as though this mattered, which at the Meridian it did, because Rosa's bread was genuinely extraordinary. He asked for sparkling water. He went back to his book. When she brought his food, he looked up, thanked her with the same attention he had given the greeting, and returned to reading while he ate. He was the only person she served that day who said thank you every single time she came to the table. Not as a reflex, as an acknowledgement. He left a 22% tip on a check that was not small. The next Wednesday, he was back. Same booth, same order, same book, still the same one, which suggested he was either a slow reader or a very thorough one. This time he asked, when she brought his food, whether she liked working at the Meridian. It was a question that guests occasionally asked, usually a small talk that required no particular answer. But the way James asked it had a quality of actual curiosity that caught her slightly off guard. She said yes, she did. She said the kitchen was remarkable and the regulars were interesting, and there was a rhythm to the lunch service that she found satisfying in a way she had not expected when she started. He said, "That is interesting. What is the part you did not expect?" And she found herself standing at his table during a moderately busy Wednesday lunch service, actually thinking about the question rather than producing a rote answer. She said, "The physical intelligence of it. The way your body learns things your mind does not consciously teach it." He considered this and said, "That is what I like about my work, too. The way a structure teaches you things about itself once you start paying attention to it." There was a pause. Angela walked past and raised her eyebrows briefly at Victoria in the way of a colleague indicating that there are other tables that also require attention. Victoria excused herself and went back to work. But she thought about that exchange for the rest of the afternoon. The following Wednesday, he was back. This time he had a different book. She noticed the title and mentioned, when she came to take his order, that she had read it. He looked up with what she could only describe as genuine delight and said, "What did you think?" They spoke about it for 4 or 5 minutes, about the structure of the narrative, about whether the ending was earned, about what the book was really about beneath its surface, and it was the kind of conversation that has a particular quality, a particular electricity that you recognize when you are inside of it, but cannot quite explain to someone who is not there. Over the weeks that followed, the Wednesday visits became the fixed point of Victoria's week in a way she had not anticipated and did not immediately acknowledge to herself. James always came at the same time, 12:30, reliably, a full 45 minutes before the lunch rush reached its absolute peak. He was always with a book. He always had the salmon, except for 2 Wednesdays in June when he had the braised short rib, both times explaining that he felt he owed it to himself to try something different while knowing he would probably go back to the salmon eventually, which she found unreasonably charming. She began to pay attention to the things he mentioned in their brief conversations. He had a sister in Atlanta who had just had her first baby, And he spoke about this with a warmth and an excitement that suggested a closeness with his family that Victoria found genuinely moving. He was reading his way through a list of novels his college professor had given him 12 years ago that he had only recently resumed, which explained the range of titles and the occasional note she noticed him making in the margins. He had strong opinions about bridges, which ones he found structurally interesting, which ones were engineering compromises dressed up as aesthetic choices, which ones were the specific kind of beautiful that comes from a problem being solved so well that the solution becomes invisible. He talked about the Brooklyn Bridge with the reverence that other people reserve for works of art, which was, Victoria thought, exactly correct. Their conversations were always brief. This was not because either of them wished them briefer, but because Victoria had a job to do and James was respectful of that fact in a way she found, in the context of the rest of her life, almost startlingly considerate. He never flagged her down when she was clearly occupied with another table. He never extended a conversation past the point where she could reasonably stand at his table without neglecting her other responsibilities. He seemed, in every interaction, to be genuinely aware that her time was not entirely her own, which was such a different experience from the way she was usually treated, by people who assumed that the fact of her wealth meant her time was infinitely available, that it took her some time to recognize what the difference was and why it made the particular impact it did. She told Sophie about him in June. She called her on a Tuesday evening, the day before his Wednesday visit, and said, "There's a man who comes in every week." Sophie said, "What kind of man?" Victoria said, "A structural engineer from Georgia who reads novels and has opinions about bridges and says thank you like he means it." Sophie was quiet for a moment and then said, "This is exactly what you were afraid would happen." Victoria said, "I know." Sophie said, "What are you going to do?" Victoria said, "Nothing. I am just going to take his order and talk about books and be a regular person." Sophie said, "That is the worst plan you have ever had." Victoria said, "I know that too." In July, on a Wednesday that happened to fall on the day the restaurant was running a modified menu due to a delivery issue, Victoria found herself explaining the substitutions to James with a level of kitchen knowledge that was, she realized as the words were coming out, slightly more detailed than a floor server who had been in the job for 3 months would typically possess. She caught herself and redirected, and James did not appear to notice, or if he noticed, he did not comment. But Diane, who had been refilling water glasses at the adjacent table, looked at her once, very quickly, with an expression that was thoughtful and entirely neutral, and said nothing. At the end of July, James asked for her phone number. He did it with the slightly formal, earnest quality that she had come to understand was his natural register for things that mattered to him, as opposed to his ease with things that did not. He said, "I hope this is not inappropriate, but I would like to take you to dinner sometime, if you would be willing." He said it with the slight formality of someone who has thought about how to say something and then said it anyway despite the risk of it landing badly, which was in her experience the most reliable indicator of genuine sincerity. She said yes. She gave him her number. Not her real number, the one associated with her real name and her real phone plan and her real digital life. The number of a second phone she had purchased specifically for this purpose, which felt both calculated and, she told herself, entirely reasonable given the circumstances. She texted Sophie that evening. "I said yes." Sophie responded, "God help us all. I will start chilling the wine." Their first date was in early August. James had suggested a small Vietnamese restaurant in the East Village, a place he liked for a Tuesday evening, which was his preferred night for dinner, he explained, because it was quiet enough to have a real conversation. Victoria wore a dress she bought specifically that week, simple and not expensive, from a store on the Lower East Side. She wore the same plain glasses. She took the subway. She arrived 4 minutes early and waited at the table, which was against her instincts. She was accustomed to arriving at restaurants and being shown to a table by a host who knew her name and her preference. And she found, in the 4 minutes of waiting, a kind of uncomplicated ordinariness that felt absurdly like something close to peace. James arrived, and he looked pleased to see her in a way that was unambiguous and not managed. He said, "You look great," not in the performed way of someone deploying a compliment. in the way of someone registering the fact of something and saying it out loud, because the alternative, not saying it, seemed less honest. They were at the table for 4 hours. She told him about growing up in Manhattan, in a version that was true in every material way except the specifics of the building and the neighborhood. She talked about her mother in Chicago and the particular quality of that relationship, affectionate and slightly underpowered, both of them meaning more than they managed to say. He talked about his mother in Savannah and the way she had raised him and his sister on a teacher's salary with a resourcefulness and a dignity that had shaped the way he understood money, not as a measure of worth, but simply as a tool, more or less of which you had, depending on circumstances that were only partially within your control. He talked about his grandmother, Ruth, who had died 3 years ago and whom he clearly missed in the active, present-tense way of someone who has not yet moved the grief into the past. Victoria talked about the loneliness of boarding school, which was also true and which she had rarely said aloud. He talked about the specific loneliness of being the scholarship kid at City College, the person who did not quite belong to the wealthy world and also could no longer fully return to the one he had come from. She found, in that conversation, the thing she had been trying to locate in the undercover experiment from the beginning. Not just a man who did not know who she was, but a man who was willing to talk about the real shape of his life, the losses and the gaps, and the things that had been hard, not just the version of himself that served well in polished company. And she found herself talking back the same way, saying true things, not managing the conversation toward an outcome, just talking. After dinner, he walked her home, as far as the corner of her block, which was as far as she was prepared to let him come. He did not push. He stood at the corner and said, "I had a genuinely great evening. I hope you would like to do this again." She said, "I would." He said good night with a sincerity that had no performance in it at all, and she walked the half block to her building and went upstairs and stood at the window of her 47th floor penthouse looking out at the city, which was not the view of someone who had spent the evening at a Vietnamese restaurant in the East Village and taken the subway home. And she had a long and uncomfortable moment with that contradiction before she called Sophie and said, "I am in serious trouble." Sophie said, "I know. You have been for weeks. Now, what can we talk about when you're going to tell him?" Victoria said, "Not yet." Sophie said, "Victoria." Victoria said, I know, but not yet." The weeks of August and September were, by any honest account, some of the happiest of Victoria's adult life, which is a complicated thing to say about a period she spent in a sustained deception. But happiness is not always clean, and the particular happiness of those weeks had a quality she had not experienced before, the happiness of being known, incrementally and genuinely, by someone who had no preconception to override. James knew she was quick-minded and funny. He knew she had an unexpected passion for structural engineering that she could not entirely explain, and that he found both amusing and flattering. He knew she read widely and thought hard about what she read. He knew she was capable of genuine wonder, that she could be stopped mid-sentence by the quality of light on the river or the structural elegance of a pedestrian bridge or the way a piece of music made the air in a room feel different. He knew she was guarded about certain things, her childhood, her father, the specifics of her financial situation, in a way that he attributed, reasonably and without pressure, to privacy. He did not know about the penthouse. He did not know about the empire. He did not know that the restaurant where he spent his Wednesday lunches was, in every legal and financial sense, partially hers. He met Sophie in September, briefly, outside a coffee shop near Victoria's stated neighborhood. Sophie was warm and funny and slightly terrifying in the way of women who are extremely intelligent and have very firm opinions about the people they love, and James navigated her assessment with a naturalness that suggested either genuine confidence or the specific kind of ease that comes from having nothing to hide, which was, Victoria noted, probably the same thing. Afterwards, Sophie texted Victoria, "He is the one. Do not ruin this." Victoria did not respond to that message for several hours, because the pressure of the thing was building. She had planned to tell him in October. She had identified a quiet restaurant, a private table, a Tuesday evening when neither of them had other commitments. She had written and rewritten in her head the conversation she was going to have with him, The sequence of revelations, the explanation of the why, the acknowledgement of the unfairness of what she had done, the hope, which she held onto with great care because hope was not something she extended easily, that he might understand. She had told Sophie the plan. Sophie had said, "Do it before something forces your hand." Victoria had said, "Nothing is going to force my hand." She had been wrong. It was Diane who changed the course of the story, and it happened not through malice, but through the simple, unstoppable logic of a perceptive person spending enough time in the presence of inconsistency. Diane had been noticing things for months. Small things, individually explainable. The way Victoria occasionally spoke to Frank, not with the careful deference of a junior employee, but with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously by the people in the room. The way she could glance at a food cost printout left on the break room table and appear to have absorbed its contents before she looked away. The way, twice, she had made reference to the details of other Hartwell properties in a way that was slightly too specific for someone who simply worked in one of the chain's restaurants. The way, most damningly, she had once given an opinion on a vendor contract discussion she had overheard between Frank and the assistant manager, an opinion that was not just correct, but correct in the way of someone who understood the contractual framework from the inside. Diane had not done anything with these observations for a long time. She was not a suspicious person by nature, and she was a person who understood that everyone had a story they were managing and that it was not her job to excavate other people's stories. But she mentioned Victoria to her nephew Michael at a family dinner in early October. Michael worked in commercial real estate and was the kind of person who spent a lot of time on the internet reading about the business world. Diane described Victoria, her manner, her intelligence, the name Harris, the way she carried herself. And Michael said, with the casual thoroughness of someone who has become very good at Googling things, "Victoria Harris who works at the Meridian?" He searched for a moment and then showed Diane his phone. The photograph was from a profile in Crane's New York business, published 3 years earlier. The woman in the photograph was wearing a slightly different hair color and no glasses, and her expression had the careful, composed quality of someone being professionally photographed rather than a relaxed, slightly disheveled look of someone in the middle of a lunch service. But it was unmistakably the same face. The caption read, "Victoria Hartwell, 25, Director of Strategy, Hartwell International, photographed at the company's annual investment conference." Diane stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she put her nephew's phone down and picked up her wine glass and said nothing for the remainder of the dinner. The following Monday, she came into work and said nothing. She made no changes to her behavior. She watched Victoria with the same warm, careful attention she had always given her, and she was trying to decide what to do, whether the right thing was to say something to Victoria directly, to give her the opportunity to address whatever was happening on her own terms, or whether this was simply not her business, and she should let it go. She had not yet made that decision when the information left her hands entirely. Tyler Nguyen was 24 years old and had been working as a junior manager at the Meridian for 8 months. He was bright and personable and intensely ambitious in the way of someone who has decided very young that they want to succeed, but has not yet fully developed the judgment to distinguish between the kinds of success that are worth pursuing and the kinds that are not. He had a contact, a man named Kevin who wrote gossip and business items for a website that occupied the blurry territory between celebrity news and business reporting, and Tyler had, over the course of his time at the Meridian, occasionally passed Kevin small items in exchange for small favors. Nothing dramatic. A celebrity sighting in the restaurant, a notable reservation. Once the fact that a real estate developer was using a Hartwell property for meetings related to an acquisition he had not yet announced. Small things. Harmless things, Tyler told himself, because Tyler was someone who was very good at telling himself that the lines he had crossed were not the lines he thought they were. He overheard enough of what Diane had shared with a colleague to understand the outline. He confirmed the rest through 20 minutes of his own research on a Tuesday evening. And on Wednesday morning, before Victoria arrived for her lunch shift, Tyler sent Kevin an email with the photograph from Crane's and a paragraph summary of what he had discovered. Kevin called back in 40 minutes to confirm the details and then filed his piece within the hour. The headline went live at 11:45 a.m. Victoria's phone, the real one, which was set to silent in her locker in the staff room, received 47 notifications before she finished her prep and picked it up during her break at 2 o'clock. She looked at the screen for a long time. She was sitting on the small bench in the break room, still in her apron, a half-eaten plate of staff meal beside her. Around her, the normal sounds of the post-lunch rush wind down continued. The clatter of plates being cleared, Rose's voice directing the prep for dinner service. Marcus in the corridor, singing something under his breath with characteristic commitment to the performance. And Victoria sat in the middle of all of it with 47 notifications on her phone and the knowledge that the story she had been telling carefully and completely for 6 months was over. The first call she made was to Sophie. Sophie answered on the second ring and said, "I saw it." Victoria said, "I know." Sophie said, "Are you okay?" Victoria said she was not sure. Sophie said, "What do you need right now?" And Victoria thought about that honestly for a moment and said, "I need to think." Sophie said, "Okay, call me when you are ready." The second call she made was to her father. Gerald Hartwell was in a meeting in Chicago when his assistant patched the call through, which she was authorized to do for Victoria's calls regardless of circumstances. He stepped out of the meeting and answered with the slightly clipped, present-tense alertness of a man who has spent 30 years being the person that other people bring their problems to, and therefore approaches unexpected calls with the assumption that something needs to be solved. Victoria told him everything. She told him from the beginning, which was the Thursday afternoon in March, when she had been sitting in his office reading the staffing report for the Meridian. She told him about the resume under the name Harris, the dyed hair, the glasses, the training weeks with Diane. She told him about the 6 months on the floor, about Marcus and Diane and Rosa and Frank, and the way the restaurant felt from inside the work of it. She told him about James. She told him about the plan to tell James herself, in 3 days, before anything forced her hand. And then she told him that she had run out of 3 days. Gerald was quiet throughout this. Not the quiet of someone who is not paying attention, but the specific quality of silence that belongs to someone who is listening with complete focus and reserving all judgment until they have the full picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a little longer. And then he said, in a voice that was careful and measured, and underneath the measurement, something that she had not expected, "I wish you had told me. Not because I would have stopped you. I would not have stopped you. But because I would have liked to know that my daughter was brave enough to want something real enough to go looking for it like that." Victoria did not respond immediately, because in 30 years of knowing her father, she had not heard him say precisely that thing in precisely that way, and she needed a moment to receive it. He said, "What do you need from me right now?" She said, "Time," in a statement from the company that doesn't make me sound like I was playing a game. He said, "I will take care of it. Do what you need to do with the young man." Victoria said, "Dad." He said, "What?" She said, "Thank you." He said, "Call me tonight." Then he went back to his meeting, because Gerald Hartwell was a man who compartmentalized with extraordinary efficiency, and the meeting, she knew, would receive the same undivided attention the phone call had. The third conversation, the one she had been building toward and dreading and rehearsing in fragments for 6 months, happened that evening. James had called her at 4 o'clock. She had seen his name on her screen, on the second phone, his contact in the second phone, and she had let it ring twice and then answered. He said, "Is it true?" His voice had the quality of something being held very carefully, the way you hold something that is fragile, not because you intend to drop it, but because you are aware of the possibility. She said yes. He exhaled. Then there was a silence that lasted long enough that she became aware of the ambient sound of where he was. At his desk, she imagined the sounds of an engineering office in the late afternoon, the specific quality of city noise that came through a window in Lower Manhattan. He said, "I need to see you." She said, "I know." He said, "Tonight." She said, "Yes." They met at the Vietnamese restaurant. It had been a suggestion, and she had understood the choice. Not a place she had suggested, not a place that was hers. Neutral ground, and also ground that meant something which is different from neutral ground in its most functional sense. She arrived first. She sat at the same table. She ordered water. She did not look at her phone. She thought about what she wanted to say, and then she decided not to have a plan, which was the most difficult decision she had made in a very long time, because she was someone who always had a plan, who always managed the parameters of conversation toward an outcome. Tonight, she was not going to do that. Tonight, she was simply going to tell the truth and let the consequences exist unmanaged. James arrived. He sat down across from her. He looked at her for a long moment. He was wearing the same dark jacket he'd worn to their first dinner, which she did not think was intentional, but which she noticed. His expression was not cold. It was not angry, though she would have understood anger completely. It was the expression of someone who has received a significant piece of information about their own life and is still in the process of integrating it. She told him everything, not the version she had rehearsed, with its careful sequencing and its strategic placements of context before confession. Everything in roughly the order it had actually happened. The 3 relationships that had ended in betrayal or in the suffocating weight of what her name meant to other people. The decision she had made in March in her father's office. The resume she had constructed, the dyed hair, the glasses, the name Harris. Every Wednesday of the summer, when he had come in with his book and his salmon and his attentive gratitude, and she had been simultaneously exactly who she presented herself to be and completely someone else. She told him about the conversation she'd had with Sophie after their first date. She told him she had planned to tell him on Saturday, 3 days from now. She told him about Tyler and Kevin and the notification count she had found on her phone at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while still wearing her apron and sitting next to an untouched plate of staff meal. And then she stopped talking, and she waited. James was quiet for a long time, long enough that their waiter, a young man who had served them before and clearly sensed the atmosphere at the table, came over, assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, and retreated to the far end of the room without saying a word. James turned his water glass slowly in his hands, which was a habit she had noticed before. He did this when he was thinking seriously about something. She had noticed it the first time he did it, at their second dinner, when they were talking about a piece of architecture they had both seen recently, and he was formulating an opinion he wanted to get right before he said aloud. She watched him do it now, and she thought, I know that about him. I know the thing about how he holds a glass when he is thinking, and he does not know that I know it. And the whole terrible, beautiful complexity of what these 6 months have been is right there in that small observation. He said, Can I ask you something? She said, yes. Anything. He said, every single conversation we have ever had. Every single one. Have you been yourself? Not in the biographical sense. I know the biography was managed, but have you been yourself? She thought about that question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. She thought about the conversation about the novel, the first time she had told him what she actually thought rather than what was easy to say. She thought about the first dinner and what she had said about being afraid of never knowing if the people in her life were there for her or for what she represented. She thought about their conversation on the High Line in August when they had talked about what it meant to love your work and whether the lines between work and identity could be kept clear or whether they always blurred and whether the blurring was a problem or simply the truth of how people functioned. She thought about the Sunday at the Brooklyn Museum when they had argued gently and enjoyably about a painting for 40 minutes and reached no conclusion except that they both felt better for having argued about it. She said yes. Every single conversation. I was lying about my name. I was lying about where I lived and what I did and who my father was. I was not lying about a single thought I had out loud in your presence. Not once. He nodded slowly. He said, and the part where you were afraid that no one could see you past the name. She said, that was the most true thing I said to you in any conversation we ever had. He was quiet again. Then he said, I keep coming back to this one thing. He said, I talk to you differently than I talked to anyone in a long time, because something about the way you listened made it feel safe to say true things. And I keep asking myself, was that real? Was the thing that made me feel safe real, or was it a performance? And Victoria felt something in her chest that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it, because she understood the weight of that question and what depended on the answer. She said it was real. It is the only part of this that was entirely real from the very first day. The way I listened to you has nothing to do with my name. He looked at her. He said, I know that. That is what makes this so complicated. There was a silence. He said, I am not going to tell you I am not angry. I am angry, not the loud kind, the kind that sits in your chest and needs somewhere to go. She said, I understand that. He said, but I'm also, he stopped, started again. I'm also someone who understands why you did it. Even while I wish you had told me sooner. Even while I wish I was hearing this from you 3 days from now the way you planned, instead of having read about it on the internet at my desk at 3 in the afternoon. She said, I am sorry for that. Specifically for that. He said, tell me one thing. Just one thing that is entirely true and that you have never said to anyone. She thought about it. She said, I was happiest on Wednesday afternoons. The 30 minutes between your last bite of salmon and the point where you had to leave. Those 30 minutes of just talking. She said, I was more myself in those 30 minutes than I have been anywhere else in the last 5 years. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I have very good jokes. And it was such a specific reference to the ongoing low-grade argument they had been having since June about the quality of Marcus's jokes versus his own, that something in her chest that had been very tight suddenly loosened. Not all the way, not to the point of resolution, but enough. They stayed at that table for 3 more hours. They talked about trust and what it required and whether it could be rebuilt from a foundation that had been laid in partial truth. He said he needed time, not to decide whether he had feelings for her. That, he said, was not something that switched off because of a revelation, however disorienting. He needed time to sit with the reality of her actual life and what it looked like, and to ask himself with genuine honesty whether he was someone who could participate in that life without losing the things about himself he valued most. She said, I understand. She meant it entirely. She said, I do not need you to decide anything tonight. He said, okay. He walked her home. They stood on the same corner they had stood on after their first date, for months ago, and this time neither of them said much, because most of what needed to be said had been said, and the rest needed time to settle. He said goodnight. She walked to her building. The doorman, who had worked the door for 11 years and seen Victoria in every possible emotional state, took one look at her face and said, Welcome home, Miss Hartwell. It was the first time in 6 months she had heard her own name without planning for it, and she stopped for a moment in the lobby and breathed. Then she went upstairs, stood at her 47th floor window, looked out at the city, and called Sophie. Sophie said, Tell me everything. Victoria told her. When she finished, Sophie was quiet for a moment and then said, He is going to call. Victoria said, I do not know that. Sophie said, I do. I met him. I looked at him. He is going to call. Gerald Hartwell's statement was released by the Hartwell International Communications team the following morning. It said in its entirety that Victoria Hartwell had a long-standing and genuine commitment to understanding the guest and operational experience at Hartwell International Properties from the ground up, that her work at the Meridian reflected that commitment, and that the company was proud of the depth of engagement she brought to the business at every level. It said nothing about James. That was private. Tyler Nguyen was let go from his position at the Meridian the following Monday. The official documentation cited a performance review. No public statement was made. Frank DeLuca, who had managed the restaurant for 16 years and who was deeply and personally offended by what Tyler had done, simply ensured that the departure was handled with the quiet efficiency the situation warranted, and then returned to the task of running one of the best restaurants in Manhattan, which he did not stop doing for even one service. James called 10 days later. Victoria was in her office at the Hartwell building, back in her real office on the real floor, at the real desk, with the real city spread below her 42nd floor windows, when the second phone rang. She had kept it. She was not sure entirely why she had kept it, except that it was the phone that connected her to the version of her life that had been most real to her, and she was not ready to let that go. She answered on the first ring, which was not something she did for most people. He said, I have been thinking. She said, I know. He said, I talked to some people whose judgment I trust. He said, and I thought a lot about the thing you said about being afraid that no one could see you past the name. And I thought about the fact that I did see you past the name. I saw you before I knew the name existed, which means that whatever you were afraid of not being able to have, you had it. With me, starting at that booth by the window on the first Wednesday. She was quiet. He said, I'm not saying the rest of it is simple. I'm saying that the thing you needed to know, you know it. and I would like to figure out the rest of it together if you are willing to try. She said, yes. He said, good, because I have a structural assessment on a building in Red Hook next Saturday morning, and I was thinking you might want to come. She said, you are asking me on a date to a structural assessment. He said, I know you find it interesting. She said, I do. He said, I know what you find interesting. That is the whole point. They met on a Saturday morning in late October on a corner in Red Hook in Brooklyn, in the cool air of an autumn that had not yet decided to commit to being cold. James was already there when she arrived, standing on the sidewalk in front of a 5-story warehouse building with a clipboard and a hard hat and a completely unself-conscious enthusiasm for what they were about to do. He handed her a hard hat and said, ready? She said, more than you know. They spent 3 hours inside that building while James walked her through the process of a structural assessment. The way you read a building's history in its materials, the evidence of previous repairs and modifications, the places where the structure had been under stress, and the ways it had compensated. He was extraordinary at it, not just technically, which he was clearly and completely, but in the way he described it. He talked about buildings the way she had come to understand. He talked about everything he cared about, with attention and specificity and a genuine pleasure in the complexity of the thing. She asked questions she did not know she had until he answered one, and it opened 3 more. He answered all of them with the same patient attention he had given every conversation they had ever had in a Wednesday booth. On the walk back to the subway, they stopped for coffee at a place on a side street that had no menu on the wall and made 4 types of coffee and nothing else. They sat at a small table by the window, and James said, I want to meet your father. Victoria said, are you sure? He said, no, but I think I should. She said, he is not easy. He said, I know. I have read about him. She said, reading about him does not prepare you for actually being in the room with him. He said, good. I am better in person than on paper. She looked at him across the small table in the small coffee shop in Red Hook and thought, this is the thing I was looking for. Not this exact coffee shop or this exact moment. The feeling that I'm talking to someone who is actually here, who is paying attention, who is not performing anything. She said, you're going to be fine. He said, what makes you say that? She said, because the only question he is actually going to ask you is whether you understand what actually matters. And I think you do. He said, what actually matters? She said, people, the way things feel from the inside, whether you are paying attention. He considered this. He said, I can manage that. She said, I know you can. The dinner with Gerald happened in November at the Hartwell apartment, which Victoria had suggested because neutral ground felt, in this instance, like a kind of cowardice. If James was going to be in her life, he was going to need to be in all of it, which included the 47th floor and the view of Central Park and the fact that the art on the walls had names attached to it. Gerald was formal and precise and not entirely comfortable with his own emotions and company, which was the quality that most people found intimidating about him, and which Victoria had spent a lifetime learning to read correctly. James was direct and unimpressed, not with any intention of provocation, but simply because he was someone who had grown up in circumstances that had given him no reason to be awed by wealth, and every reason to be awed by character. Gerald asked him, at the end of dinner, over the small cups of excellent coffee that his housekeeper brought on a tray with the quiet efficiency of long practice, 3 questions. He asked what James thought about loyalty. James said loyalty was the thing that got tested under pressure, which was also the only way you ever knew it was real. Gerald nodded. He asked what James thought about failure. James said failure was information, and that the only failure that was actually problematic was the kind you declined to learn from. Gerald nodded again, more slowly. He asked what James thought Victoria's greatest strength was. James did not hesitate. He said, she knows how to pay attention to what actually matters, even when everything around her is designed to distract her from it. Gerald picked up his coffee cup. He took a small sip. He set it down. He said, yes, that is right. And the evening moved on. Victoria, watching her father's face in that moment across the dinner table, understood something about him she had not quite understood before. Gerald Hartwell had built $14 billion worth of hospitality business on a single foundational skill, which was the ability to see past the surface of things past the presentation and the numbers and the market positioning, to the actual quality of whatever he was looking at. To know the real thing when he encountered it. He had been doing it for 30 years. He had been wrong very few times. Watching him set down his coffee cup and nod at James Calloway's answer about his daughter, Victoria understood that her father was not wrong now. After dinner, when James had said his goodbyes and the door had closed behind him, Gerald stood in the hallway of his apartment for a moment and then looked at Victoria and said, "He will do." Victoria said, "High praise." Gerald said, "It is." She kissed him on the cheek, which was something she did not do frequently enough and always meant entirely. She took the elevator down and walked to the corner where James was waiting for her because he had said he would wait, and he had. They walked 20 blocks north through the November city, which was cold now and definite about it. The trees along the avenues bare and the Christmas lights beginning to appear in the storefronts, the city shifting into its winter self. They did not talk the whole way. They did not need to. Victoria thought about Diane, who had sent her a handwritten note the week after the story broke, which had been the note she had been most moved by out of the hundreds of messages she had received. The note said, "You were a very good waitress. Better than you knew you were going to be, I think. I hope whatever you were looking for in that dining room, you found it." From Diane. P.S. Marcus wants me to tell you that the joke about the structural engineer and the sushi restaurant is his best one yet, and he is saving it for when he sees you. Victoria had laughed until she had to sit down. She had written Diane back a long letter which she dropped off in person at the Meridian on a Thursday afternoon, walking in through the side entrance on the cross street, the same one she had walked through on her first day in September, 8 months earlier. Frank DeLuca had seen her from across the dining room and raised one hand in a brief, formal wave, which from Frank DeLuca was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Rosa had come out of the kitchen, which Rosa almost never did during service, and hugged her once, firmly, without saying anything, and then gone back to her kitchen. Marcus had given her the joke about the structural engineer and the sushi restaurant, which was objectively the worst joke she had ever heard, and she had laughed so hard she had to lean against the service station while Marcus looked on with the satisfaction of a man who has delivered exactly the performance he intended. Victoria returned to her role at Hartwell International in January, 6 weeks after the story broke, and the initial frenzy of media attention had settled into the particular afterglow of a story that everyone had formed an opinion about. The opinions were mixed, which was predictable. There were the people who found the whole thing romantic and courageous. The idea of a wealthy woman shedding her identity to look for genuine connection resonated deeply with a particular kind of reader, and the story was picked up and retold in lifestyle magazines and relationship columns and morning television segments with a warmth that bordered, occasionally, on sentimentality. There were the people who found it troubling, who focused on the deception itself, and argued that no romantic outcome justified 6 months of systematic dishonesty to the people who worked alongside her. There were the people who found it simply interesting from a business perspective, executives and industry journalists who focused on the operational intelligence she had gathered working the floor and what it said about the value of ground-level experience in senior leadership. Victoria read all of it. She thought all of it was partially right. The romanticism missed the difficulty. The ethical critique underweight the internal logic. The business angle missed the human center. But that was how stories worked when they left the control of the person they were about and entered the public domain, where everyone shaped them according to what they needed them to mean. What mattered to Victoria was what she knew the story meant from the inside. She was appointed director of guest experience in January, a title she had proposed herself and which Gerald had approved without modification after reading her 12-page briefing document on what the role should accomplish. The premise of the role was straightforward, though its execution was not. Victoria's 6 months at the Meridian had shown her something that the data she had been analyzing for years could not show her, that the difference between a good guest experience and an exceptional one was not findable in the metrics. It was findable in the 10 seconds between a guest walking through the door and the host making a decision about how to greet them. It was findable in the way a server managed the moment when a guest was clearly having a difficult day and needed to be left alone. It was findable in Rosa's bread, made fresh every morning, which was not the most profitable use of Rose's morning, and which Gerald had nonetheless never questioned because he understood that the bread was a statement, a physical argument about what kind of restaurant the Meridian was and what it believed about the people it served. The program Victoria built over the following year became known internally as the Floor Initiative. Its requirement was simple. Every corporate employee of Hartwell International above the level of regional coordinator was required to spend a minimum of 1 week per year working in an operational role at one of the company's properties. Not visiting, not observing, working, serving tables, or managing the front desk, or working alongside the kitchen staff, or doing the overnight inventory at a hotel. The program was not optional. It was not presented as an opportunity for executive enrichment. It was presented as a professional requirement, on the grounds that you could not make good decisions about how a guest should be treated if you had never stood in the position of the person doing the treating. The resistance was significant. There were vice presidents who were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of tying on an apron. There were marketing directors who felt the whole concept was beneath their professional dignity. There were 3 people who raised formal objections through HR, which Victoria handled with the calm, precise, entirely unmoved efficiency of someone who had spent 6 months carrying plates through a lunch rush and was not especially impressed by executive discomfort. The first round of the program happened in the spring. 43 corporate employees, dispersed across Hartwell properties, spent 1 week in operational roles. The quarterly reports from those properties, covering the 6 months after the program's implementation, showed the most significant improvement in guest satisfaction scores the company had recorded in 11 years. The improvement was not uniform across all properties, which was itself interesting data. The properties that showed the greatest improvement were the ones whose property managers had embraced the program most fully, not just complying with the corporate requirement, but genuinely investing in the process of integration, of making the corporate visitors feel as much as possible like real members of the team for the week they were there. The properties that showed the least improvement were the ones where the corporate visitors had been quietly managed around, kept in low-stakes positions, shielded from the demanding moments of service, returned each evening to separate accommodations and separate arrangements that signaled, however subtly, that they were guests of a particular kind and not colleagues of the ordinary kind. Victoria annotated this in her end-of-year report and circulated it to the board with a note that said, simply, "The data is showing us something about the relationship between genuine integration and genuine learning." Properties where the program was implemented fully showed 4 times the improvement of properties where it was managed around. This is not surprising if you have ever tried to learn something real. You have to be in it, not near it. The board received this report in December, 14 months after Victoria had tied on her first apron in the back corridor of the Meridian. They approved an expansion of the program to mandatory, twice-yearly implementation across all Hartwell properties. Gerald, reading the final page of the report in his office, found himself thinking about his mother's $3,000 loan, about the diner on Penn Avenue, about the way he had learned what a restaurant actually was, not from a business plan or a mentor or a management book, but from standing at a grill at 6 in the morning and paying attention to the people who came through the door. He called Victoria. She answered on the first ring. He said, "This is good work." She said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "Your grandmother would have found this funny." Victoria said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it, probably, but especially the part where it turned out that everything useful started with somebody deciding to pay attention." Victoria said, "She was a smart woman." Gerald said, "She was the smartest person I ever knew," which is saying something considering who I am speaking to right now. Victoria was quiet for a moment because Gerald Hartwell did not say things like that easily or often, and she had learned to receive them carefully when he did. She said, "I will see you at Sunday dinner." He said, "I will have Henri make the lamb." She said, "The lamb from the new butcher?" He said, "Yes." Victoria said, "Good. I will bring James." Gerald said, "Good. He has decent taste in wine." Victoria said, "Did you look that up?" Gerald said, "Of course I looked that up." He said, "Good night." She said, "Good night." She set the phone down on her desk and looked out her window at the city, which was doing the particular thing it did in December. the low winter light on the stone faces of the buildings, the streets below beginning to fill with the end-of-afternoon energy of a city coming loose from its workday, the lights coming on in 1,000 windows, 1,000 separate lives beginning their evening routines. She thought about the Meridian, about the Tuesday morning in September, a year and 3 months ago now, when she had stood in the back corridor tying a plain black apron around her waist with slightly trembling fingers. About the way Diane had looked at her on that first day and said, "Good. Nervous means you understand what you're doing here." She thought about the first Wednesday James had walked in with his book and his unhurried quality and his way of saying thank you. That meant something. She thought about the booth by the window and the salmon with the lemon caper sauce and 30 minutes of real conversation at the end of each week that had felt, in the midst of a year she had designed as an experiment, less like data and more like the thing she had actually been looking for all along. She thought about the floor of her kitchen in the winter 3 years ago and the lake stone feeling of another disappointment settling. She thought about the moment the story broke and the 47 notifications and the way she had sat in the staff break room with her apron still on, feeling the world she had built so carefully beginning to come apart at the seams in real time. And she thought about the Vietnamese restaurant and James turning a water glass slowly in his hands while he thought about what to say, and the question he had asked her, the exact right question, the one that went past everything that could be managed toward the thing that couldn't be. "Have you been yourself?" She thought about her answer, which had been yes, and which she had meant completely, and which she meant still. Frank DeLuca called her office the following week to discuss the upcoming annual review of the Meridian's floor operations. At the end of the call, after they had covered the agenda items, he said, "Off the record." She said, "Off the record." He said, "You were one of the better servers I had on the floor that year." She said, "Frank." He said, "I'm not saying you were the best. Diane is the best, and probably always will be. I am saying you were better than you had any right to be for someone who had never done it before." She said, "I paid attention." He said, "Yes, that is exactly what you did." He paused. He said, "Miss Hartwell." She said, "Frank." He said, "It is good to have you back." She said, "It is good to be back. Not away. Back." He said, "I understand the difference." She believed him. She always had. So here we are, at what feels like the end of this story, but is, in the truest sense, simply the place where we have to stop telling it. Because stories like Victoria's do not end. They continue, imperfect and unpredictable and full of the specific difficulty that real things carry with them. Through all the seasons and complications that follow the moment the lights come up and the curtain comes down and everyone goes home thinking they know what they have just witnessed. What we have just witnessed is a story about a woman who decided that the only way to find something real was to stop being recognizable long enough for it to find her. That decision was flawed. It was also brave. It was also, in the most fundamental way, understandable, in the way that the decisions of people who have been hurt in specific ways and are trying imperfectly to protect themselves against being hurt in those ways again are always understandable. Even when the method they have chosen is not ideal, even when the people they involve in the method would have deserved the chance to consent to it. Victoria Hartwell did not find a husband in the way the story is sometimes told, as though the restaurant was a hunting ground and the apron was a trap, and the whole thing was a strategy executed with the emotional detachment of a business acquisition. What she found was something considerably messier and more human and more valuable than that. She found, in the booth by the window at the Meridian on a succession of Wednesday lunches, someone who was paying attention to her in the specific way that people pay attention when they have no agenda except the conversation itself. And she found, in the back corridors and the staff meals and the controlled chaos of the lunch rush and the quiet after-service hours when Diane would sit on the counter in the break room and talk about her life and her family and her 30 years in the restaurant business, a version of herself she had not had access to before. A version that was good at things she had not known she was good at, that found satisfaction in the physical, immediate, human work of feeding people well, that could carry 3 plates without dropping them and read a table at 20 feet and know, before anyone said a word, whether the couple in the corner booth needed more time or needed the check. She found, in the act of doing the work, something about herself that the act of analyzing the work from above had never given her. And she brought that something back with her, into the company in the form of the Floor Initiative, into her relationship with her father, which became, over the year that followed, warmer and more specific and less formal in its affection, as though both of them had found, through the events of that year, a more direct route to saying the things they actually meant. Into her relationship with James, which continued the way real things continue, with difficulty and humor and occasional friction, and the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of being known by someone who chose to know you, who knew you past the biography and the name and the 47th floor, and still showed up on a Saturday morning in Red Hook with a hard hat and a clipboard and an unself-conscious enthusiasm for sharing the things he loved with the person he was choosing to love. Now here is what we want to know from you, because you have just spent the last hour with this story, and we think it belongs to you now as much as it belongs to Victoria. We want to know, would you have done what she did? If you were in her position, with that specific history of trust broken in those specific ways, would you have tied on the apron? Would you have walked through the staff entrance under a borrowed name and decided that the only honest path to a genuine connection was to stop being yourself in order to become more fully yourself? Or would you have found a different way? Tell us in the comments. We genuinely want to know because we read every single one. And the answers we get to questions like this one tell us more about how people actually think about love and trust and identity than any amount of analysis we could do on our own. And while you're in the comments, we want to ask you something else. What was the moment in this story that surprised you most? Was it Gerald's response on the phone? Not the anger or the management of the situation you might have expected, but the quiet admission that he would have wanted to know his daughter was brave enough to try? Was it James's question in the Vietnamese restaurant? Not the accusation you might have feared, but the precise, careful, honest inquiry about whether the person sitting across from him had been real? Was it Diane's note, perhaps the most human thing in a story full of human things, saying simply, "You were a very good waitress. I hope you found what you were looking for"? Or was it something else? A moment smaller than those, a Wednesday afternoon detail, a hard hat and red hook, a coffee cup set down with a nod? We think the moments that surprise us in stories like this one are the moments that tell us something about what we actually believe, about love and trust and what it means to see someone. Victoria Hartwell went looking for a man who could see her without the context that usually preceded her. What she discovered along the way was that the act of letting herself be seen required something she had not expected to be the hardest part of the whole enterprise. Not the apron, not the false name, not the Wednesday lunches or the cover story or the 6 months of sustained and careful performance. The hardest part was the moment in the Vietnamese restaurant when she stopped performing entirely, when she put down the plan and the managed narrative and the strategic sequencing and simply told the truth and waited with no idea what the truth was going to produce. That is the part of this story we want you to take with you. Not the romance of the disguise, the courage of the undisguised. The moment you stop managing the outcome and let the real thing be seen and simply wait to find out what it is worth to someone else. That is not a billionaire's moment. That is every person's moment. That is the moment that every one of us, in one form or another, in one relationship or another, in one version of our lives or another, eventually has to face. And the question that moment asks is not whether you are brave enough to disguise yourself. It is whether you are brave enough to take the disguise off. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you want to call someone or tell someone or sit quietly for a moment and think about the people in your life who know you past your name and your context and your careful presentation, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Send it to a friend. Send it to a sister. Send it to the person in your life who is tired of being seen only as what they represent rather than who they actually are. And if you want more stories like this one, more real, more human, more surprising than the headline ever managed to contain, make sure you subscribe right now so you are here for what is coming. Because the next story we're going to tell you involves a woman who received a letter that had been lost in the mail for 22 years. A letter that changed everything she thought she knew about the most important decision of her life. And a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for exactly as long as it took for that letter to arrive. Trust us. You're going to want to be here for that one. We'll see you next time.